Introduction to an episode of war. Stephen Crane is considered the master of writing about war. Ernest Hemingway applauded him in his collection in 1942 for having the finest book in Americana, The Red Badge of Courage. An episode of war brings it into a very condensed space with a lieutenant who is sitting dividing coffee, an innocent activity, and suddenly is wounded in the arm. Interestingly, he does not die, he only has an amputation. But the point is, out of nowhere comes this moment. And many people talk about naturalism or realism, and that's effective in this short story. But the most important thing is the vagaries of warfare and human conduct. Here he is dividing coffee, and suddenly, from nowhere, he's wounded from a distant shot at random. He then goes to try to fix his problem, and he goes and has somebody bind up his wound ineffectually, and then a doctor promises to fix him and not amputate, but he winds up having his arm amputated. He goes home to his family in the last few sentences, and he says, well, it doesn't mean that much. And what's so interesting about that is the lieutenant survived the war. In other words, he did have his arm amputated, but he lived through it. So the ironies build on each other throughout this fine work. An episode of war, I think, is best read after you read The Red Badge of Courage to get a full sense of Crane and what he's doing with his imagery. What's masterful about it is the use of colors and distance. And do note that these are people wandering around this universe because no one's named. You never know the name of the doctor, the binder of wounds, or the officer himself. An episode of war. The lieutenant's rubber blanket lay on the ground, and upon it he poured the company's supply of coffee. Corporals and other representatives of the grimy and hot-throated men who lined the breastwork had come for each squad's portion. The lieutenant was frowning and serious at this task of division. His lips pursed as he drew with his sword various crevices in the heap until brown squares of coffee, astoundingly equal in size, appeared on the blanket. He was on the verge of a great triumph in mathematics, and the corporals were thronging forward, each to reap a little square, when suddenly the lieutenant cried out and looked quickly at a man near him as if he suspected it was a case of personal assault. The others cried out also when they saw blood upon the lieutenant's sleeve. He had winced like a man stung, swayed dangerously, and then straightened. The sound of his hoarse breathing was plainly audible. He looked sadly, mystically, over the breastwork at the green face of a wood where now were many little puffs of white smoke. During this moment, the men about him gazed statue-like and silent, astonished and awed by this catastrophe, which happened when catastrophes were not expected, when they had leisure to observe it. As the lieutenant stared at the wood, they too swung their heads, so that for another instant all hands, still silent, contemplated the distant forest as if their minds were fixed upon the mystery of a bullet's journey. The officer had, of course, been compelled to take his sword into his left hand. He did not hold it by the hilt. He gripped it at the middle of the blade awkwardly. Turning his eyes from the hostile wood, he looked at the sword as he held it there, and seemed puzzled as to what to do with it, where to put it. In short, this weapon had of a sudden become a strange thing to him. He looked at it in a kind of stupefaction, as if he had been endowed with a trident, a sceptre, or a spade. Finally, he tried to sheathe it. To sheathe the sword held by the left hand at the middle of the blade and a scabbard hung at the left hip is a feat worthy of a sawdust ring. This wounded officer engaged in a desperate struggle with the sword and the wobbling scabbard, and during the time of it he breathed like a wrestler. But at this instant the men, the spectators, awoke from their stone-like poses and crowded forward sympathetically. The orderly sergeant took the sword and tenderly placed it in the scabbard. At the time he leaned nervously backward and did not allow even his fingers to brush the body of the lieutenant. A wound gives strange dignity to him who bears it. Well, men shy from this new and terrible
Sample complete. Ready to continue?